When you hear the phrase divine promise, what actually goes through your mind? Like, if we're being completely honest, you probably picture something entirely mystical.
Right, something supernatural, yeah.
Exactly. Something playing out in a realm we can't touch or measure. We are, conditioned to think of it as this guarantee from the heavens that requires absolute blind faith to believe in.
A concept completely divorced from the hard, concrete realities of the physical world we wake up in every single day.
Yeah, we treat it as theology, right?
Yeah.
Not reality. But the scholar Allama Parwez, when analyzing these historical Quranic texts, specifically the passages in Surah Az-Zumar, he basically takes the sledgehammer to that mystical framing.
He really does. He strips it away entirely.
He takes this core phrase, God's promise, or, wa Allah, and argues that for centuries it's been fundamentally mistranslated, or at least misunderstood through the lens of traditional dogma.
Yeah, he says we shouldn't be reading it as a mystical guarantee at all.
Right.
Instead, he translates it purely into modern scientific and sociological terms. He's arguing that this phrase actually describes a rigid, universal law of cause and effect.
It's like a blueprint for a rationally governed universe.
Exactly. He's essentially outlining the physics of society.
The physics of society, I love that.
Well, to truly grasp how radical that reframing is, we have to look closely at how we define scientific laws in our modern world. Think about the law of gravity or the laws of thermodynamics.
Well, fluid dynamics, yeah.
Right. In the realm of science, a physical law is defined by a simple, unyielding equation. If X happens, then Y will universally follow.
So if you drop an apple from a tree, it falls to the ground.
It doesn't matter who drops the apple. It doesn't matter if the person dropping it is a king or a peasant, wealthy or destitute, virtuous or corrupt.
The outcome is always the same.
Because the physical law is immutable. And Parwez asserts that this specific text is doing the exact same thing, but for human societies. It is establishing a socio-economic physics.
So the text isn't offering arbitrary religious rewards or punishments.
Not at all. It is laying out immutable structural laws for human civilization. It's stating very clearly that if you structure your society this specific way, if you implement these particular socioeconomic practices, then that specific societal outcome is mathematically guaranteed.
Wow, so it's an unbroken, inevitable chain of causality.
Precisely.
Let's actually map out the contrast he draws here, because the distinction between a rational law and arbitrary rule is really where this whole concept pivots. He compares this idea of a universal rational law against the command of an authoritarian dictator.
Yeah, that's a crucial comparison.
Think about the mechanics of how a dictator operates. A dictator demands obedience without offering any logical explanation. The rule is simply, because I said so or because I hold the power.
Right, and as a citizen in that system, you aren't allowed to ask why the rule exists.
You certainly aren't allowed to ask what the logical long-term outcome of the rule will be. It's just a pure arbitrary exercise of power. The ruler could decide tomorrow that taxes are doubled or that a certain industry is banned based on nothing but their own mood.
But a rational law is the exact antithesis of that. A rational law explains the cause and the inevitable effect.
It doesn't demand blind submission.
Exactly. It offers a transparent equation.
Yeah.
It treats the human being not as a subject to be dominated, but as an intellect capable of understanding the mechanics of reality.
And it completely removes the arbitrary nature of authority, which, is the foundational terror of living under a dictatorship.
Yeah. If a governing structure operates like a tyrant, it has to rely on fear, unpredictability, and constant surveillance. The ruler changes the rules, so the citizens live in a state of perpetual anxiety.
But a system built on universal laws, on the socioeconomic physics Parwez is describing, is entirely transparent.
It is. The governing framework essentially says, we aren't demanding you follow this policy because we have a police force to compel you. We are telling you that if you implement a fundamentally unjust economic policy, the structural rot will eventually, inevitably, cause your society to collapse.
That collapse is the inevitable Y to your policy's X.
Right. It's an appeal to human intellect. It's asking society to recognize that you cannot cheat the social physics any more than you can cheat gravity.
I mean, think about the systems you operate in daily. Your workplace, your local government, the broader global economy. Are they built on arbitrary authority?
Where the rules shift depending on who happens to hold the most leverage or capital on any given day.
Yeah, where a CEO or politician can carve out exceptions for themselves, or are those systems built on transparent, rational laws where the outcomes of actions are clearly defined, scientifically predictable, and applied universally without exception?
Because Parwez is arguing, quite bluntly, that any human system built on the former on arbitrary power is structurally doomed.
It contains the seeds of its own destruction.
Which leads us directly to the mechanism of how that doom actually unfolds. Because he doesn't just say bad systems collapse.
Right. He extracts a very specific mechanism from the text to explain the process, relying on this really powerful, observable agricultural metaphor.
Yeah, the source material points to the water cycle and the growth of crops to illustrate how societal actions compound over time.
It's a very grounded process that anyone, anywhere in the world can observe. Rain falls from the sky, a specific seed is planted in the earth, it germinates beneath the soil.
It grows, it ripens, it eventually turns yellow, and the chaff is separated from the grain. The core, undeniable principle here is that you reap exactly what you sow.
If you plant a specific seed, you get a specific crop. You cannot plant a seed of wheat and expect a harvest of corn.
Or plant a thistle and expect a rose.
Translating that biological reality into human society, Parwez focuses on the concept of oppression or exploitation, which is often referred to in the text as zulm.
Yeah, so
Now, usually when we hear the word zulm, we filter it through a religious lens and think of it as a personal sin, like telling a lie or being mean to someone.
But in the context of this socioeconomic physics, Parwez defines it purely structurally. Zulm literally translates to putting something where it does not belong.
Oh, interesting. So in a societal context, what does that mean?
It means structural exploitation. It is taking the wealth, resources, or labor generated by the collective many and artificially hoarding it in the hands of a privileged few.
It's disrupting the natural equilibrium of a society.
Exactly. The law of social physics dictates that if a system actively plants the seeds of exploitation, if its foundational structures rely on zulm, that society cannot permanently flourish.
The mathematics of the system simply do not work. The society will inevitably wither, turn yellow like the crop in the metaphor, and collapse.
And the agricultural metaphor is crucial because it introduces the most nuanced and dangerous variable in this entire equation: time. If we accept that systemic exploitation mathematically leads to societal collapse, the obvious question is why exploitative systems seem to survive and even thrive for so long.
Right. Why do empires built on slavery or hyper-extractive capitalism endure for centuries?
Parwez addresses this through the concept of molut, which translates to a time delay, a respite, or a gestation period.
Like the seed.
Exactly. Let's go back to the seed. In physical nature, a seed doesn't sprout the millisecond it touches the soil. It requires a gestation period.
It sits hidden beneath the earth, absorbing moisture, undergoing all these complex chemical changes.
Breaking down its outer shell, all before a single green shoot ever breaks the surface. To a person staring at the dirt, nothing is happening. But structurally, everything is happening.
So in social physics, there's a similar unavoidable delay between the implementation of an unjust system and the visible manifestation of its ultimate collapse.
Yes, exactly.
Wait, I have to jump in here because that delay, that molut, is exactly the problem, isn't it? If the rot is invisible for years or even generations, this is exactly why people lose faith in the very concept of justice.
That's a great point.
I mean, if there's a massive time lag, the consequences are entirely invisible to the people living through the exploitation. Look at an economic bubble.
Or the lead up to the 2008 housing crisis.
Exactly. Or look at long-term environmental degradation. The systemic damage is accumulating invisibly every single day. The seeds of collapse are germinating. But because the collapse isn't instantaneous, the exploiters, the architects at the top of the system look around, check their bank accounts, and think they're winning.
They feel completely untouchable.
They look at the sky and say, where is the supposed physics you're talking about? We're doing great. And meanwhile, the exploited people look at the exact same system and feel entirely hopeless.
They think the law of cause and effect is broken, the bad guys are winning, and the universe doesn't care. That visceral frustration you were describing is precisely the trap Parwez identifies. This invisible, imperceptible accumulation of consequences completely deceives authoritarian and exploitative structures.
They become intoxicated by their immediate visible power.
Because the timeline of societal collapse often spans multiple human generations, the individuals currently in power completely ignore the structural rot happening deep within the foundation.
Think of it like watching the hour hand on a grandfather clock.
That's a great analogy.
If you stare at it for 5 seconds, it appears perfectly stationary. Your immediate observation tells you the clock is broken or stopped. But it is moving. It is relentlessly marching forward.
And Parwez argues that to perceive the inevitable outcome of a society requires deep intellect, historical insight, and an understanding of structural laws. It requires looking beyond that 5-second window of the present moment.
The exploiter assumes the lack of immediate punishment means they've beaten the system. They mistake the malut, the biological gestation period of their own destruction, for permanent immunity.
And that illusion of immunity perfectly sets up Parwez's critique of how we currently organize the modern world. When he looks at the dominant global power structures, he essentially diagnoses a massive dual societal failure.
He breaks the world down into two opposing, but equally fundamentally flawed camps. Let's look at the first camp. He fiercely critiques hyper-materialistic societies, which largely points to the modernized, industrialized West.
Yes.
Now, what's fascinating is that he doesn't just dismiss them, he fully acknowledges their triumphs. He points out that these societies have perfectly mastered the physical laws of nature.
They figured out the equations.
Right, they understand aerodynamics, they understand quantum mechanics, they put rovers on Mars, they split the atom, they built global communication networks.
They applied that if X, then Y formula to the physical universe and achieved a level of material wealth and technological supremacy that is historically unprecedented.
But, and this is the fatal flaw, he argues they operate entirely without a structural moral compass or a unified social law. They mastered the physics of matter, but completely ignored the physics of society.
They assumed that material abundance and technological progress would automatically generate societal stability and human fulfillment.
Which it obviously didn't.
Right, because their socioeconomic structures are still heavily reliant on unchecked exploitation, extreme wealth concentration, and cutthroat competition rather than structural equity.
So all that accumulated material wealth doesn't prevent societal decay. In many ways, it accelerates it. It amplifies the inequality.
You end up with a society that has the technology to edit human genes, but also has rampant homelessness, structural violence, and epidemics of psychological despair.
To use an analogy, they've engineered a technologically flawless, aerodynamic sports car capable of going 300 miles an hour. But they have no map, they have no agreed-upon destination, and the steering wheel is entirely disconnected from the axle.
They are moving incredibly fast, but structurally they are headed toward a cliff.
The mastery of physical laws cannot save a society that is actively violating social laws.
Exactly. And then we look at the other side of the globe. Parwez pivots and fiercely critiques traditional, dogma-driven religious societies. And his analysis here is unsparing.
He points out that these societies have done the exact opposite of the West. They have completely abandoned reason and intellect. They abandoned the study of natural laws entirely.
He points to historical absurdities in these cultures to show how deep the rot goes. For example, theologians in the past issuing religious edicts to ban the use of loudspeakers in places of worship.
Wait, really? Loudspeakers? Why?
Because they didn't understand the physical science of acoustics. They didn't understand how sound waves could be electronically amplified, so they assumed the technology contained a spirit or was inherently profane.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
By making intellect, observation, and scientific inquiry forbidden or suspect, these societies effectively guarantee their own backwardness.
Their own economic failure and their own perpetual subjugation by the societies that did master the physical laws.
Exactly. They are trying to operate in a physical universe while intentionally blinding themselves to the fundamental rules of how that universe works.
It is a profound, tragic irony. One society mastered the physical world but lost the structural compass for human equity.
And the other claims to hold the moral compass, but absolutely refuses to learn how to walk in the physical world.
Both are structurally doomed because both are living in denial of half of reality.
But Parwez goes a step deeper into the mechanics of human behavior here. And he introduces a profound pushback against one of the most foundational ideas of Western philosophy. We have to talk about Socrates.
Ah, yes. Socrates famously claimed that knowledge is virtue. The core idea there is that if a human being truly, intellectually knows what is right and good, they will automatically do what is right and good.
Right. If a person commits an injustice, Socratic philosophy argues it's only because they are ignorant of the truth. If you just educate them, if you just give them the data, they will behave justly.
And Parwez completely dismantles this assumption, doesn't he?
He absolutely tears it apart.
Yeah, this is where the behavioral psychology of his theory gets really sharp. Parwez says that knowing a socioeconomic system is unjust, or knowing that corruption is destructive in the long term is completely insufficient to actually change human behavior.
Intellect alone cannot stop exploitation.
Let's ground this in reality. You can take the most highly educated CEO in the world, someone with multiple advanced degrees from Ivy League institutions.
Someone who understands economic theory, who understands ecological models perfectly.
Right. They can look at the data and know, as a pure intellectual fact, that dumping toxic waste into a local river will cause long-term environmental collapse and poison the community.
Their intellect is fully functioning. They are not ignorant of the facts.
But if dumping that waste saves the company $50 million this quarter and guarantees them a massive personal bonus, they will still knowingly pollute the river.
The intellect analyzes the data, but the intellect alone does not have the power to stop the exploitative action.
Because the intellect is merely an analytical tool, it is a processor of information. It is not a motivational engine.
It can tell you how to build a bomb, and it can tell you the blast radius of the bomb, but it cannot inherently tell you whether or not you should drop it.
Wow, that's perfectly put. So to bridge that massive gap between knowing and doing, Parwez introduces the necessity of qalb.
Yes, qalb. In traditional translations, qalb is usually just translated as the heart.
Which make it sound very romantic and, sentimental.
Exactly. But in Parwez's structural framework, it translates roughly to the internalized emotional core, or a deep-seated, unshakable conviction.
You can understand a concept intellectually in your prefrontal cortex, but until it penetrates the qalb, until it becomes an internalized, almost instinctual conviction that aligns your personal desires with the universal law, it will never consistently drive your actions.
A rationally governed, equitable society cannot just be a collection of incredibly smart people who have memorized the rules.
It requires individuals whose internal motivations, their very emotional cores, are completely aligned with the universal laws of equity.
I think of it like the difference between reading a warning label on a pack of cigarettes and actually experiencing the visceral reality of a health crisis. One is just data processing. The other is conviction that changes your behavior permanently.
So if intellect isn't enough, and we need this internalized alignment with universal laws, what does that actually mean for how we structure our governance in our societies?
How do we build a system that supports that?
Right. This brings us to perhaps Parwez's most radical sociological translation of the entire text. He takes the concept of shirk.
Now, if you open a theology textbook, shirk is translated as polytheism, worshiping multiple gods, bowing down to different statues.
But Parwez strips away all of that theological, ritualistic baggage. He frames shirk purely as a description of a chaotic, fractured socioeconomic and political structure.
He defines it as the societal state of having multiple conflicting human masters.
Let's examine what that actually looks like in practice, because it describes the reality of most human history. Societal polytheism means living in a structure where your life, your labor, and your security are dictated by a web of competing human authorities.
You have a corrupt political class demanding one thing to ensure your legal safety. You have an unchecked corporate monopoly demanding another thing to ensure your economic survival.
You have an arbitrary, convoluted legal code that contradicts itself, administered by bureaucrats who all have their own agendas.
You are beholden to a fragmented matrix of human authorities who are all pursuing their own self-interest, almost always at your direct expense. You are constantly trying to appease different lords of the system just to survive.
To make the absolute misery of this structure concrete, Parwez uses an incredibly relatable analogy. Let's call it the 20 bosses analogy.
Oh, this is a great one.
Imagine you are an employee and you are forced to work in a massive corporation where instead of having one clear job description, you report directly to 20 different managers.
Now, add a layer of complexity. All 20 of those managers absolutely despise each other.
Right. They have completely different agendas, different tempers, different definitions of success, and they are constantly barking conflicting orders at you all day long.
Manager A comes to your desk and says, drop everything and finish this report immediately or you're fired.
5 minutes later, Manager B walks up and says, if you waste time on that report instead of calling these clients, you're fired.
Manager C wants you to cut costs. Manager D wants you to spend money to increase quality.
Your daily life in that office is pure psychological misery. It is complete paralysis, constant fear, and total inefficiency.
And Parwez argues that this isn't just a clever metaphor for a toxic workplace. This is the exact structural reality of living under human-made, exploitative power structures.
This is what shirk actually is. It is societal polytheism.
It is the ultimate manifestation of systemic chaos. The human being in that system is crushed by the competing gravities of arbitrary rulers.
And in stark contrast to that bureaucratic, exploitative nightmare, Parwez explains the rational alternative. He translates the concept of tawhid.
Which is traditionally understood simply as monotheism, the belief in one God.
Right, but he translates it into the ultimate anti-monopoly law. In this socioeconomic physics, submitting to a single unified authority doesn't mean bowing down to a mystical dictator in the sky.
It means submitting to a single, unified, rational, and equitable constitutional framework.
It is the societal agreement that there is only one universal law of equity, and that law applies equally to absolutely everyone, from the poorest, most marginalized citizen to the wealthiest, most powerful leader.
That is such a massive paradigm shift. By submitting to this one universal law, the individual is instantly structurally freed from the tyranny of arbitrary human rulers.
You don't have to appease the 20 conflicting bosses anymore.
You don't have to bribe the politician, bow to the monopolist, or fear the arbitrary mood swings of a dictator, because none of those human bosses have the authority to bypass the universal constitution.
It is essentially a structural declaration of human liberty. Think about it like submitting to the physical law of gravity.
You understand the boundary of gravity. You know that if you jump off a building, you will fall.
But by understanding and submitting to that one universal rule, you don't have to constantly walk around in a state of terror, wondering if you might randomly float away or be crushed by the sky.
You understand the fundamental parameter of reality, and within that parameter, you are entirely free to move, to build, to live. Tawhid is the gravity of a just society.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And Parwez doesn't just present this as abstract theory. He uses historical case studies to prove the absolute necessity of this unified law and what happens when societies violate it.
He points to historical figures mentioned in the text, like Pharaoh and Nimrod.
But again, consistent with his entire methodology, he completely removes the religious villainy from these figures. He doesn't treat them as cartoonish bad guys who just hated religion.
He frames them as historical archetypes of authoritarian overreach. Pharaoh represents any human power structure, a government, an empire, a corporation that claims absolute, unchecked supremacy.
These are systems that look at their populace and say, I am the supreme law. My word is the physics of this society.
What the historical record shows us, consistently and without fail, is that whenever a system claims that kind of unchecked polytheistic power over others, it structurally blinds itself.
The intoxication of absolute power creates massive intellectual and informational blind spots.
Because they surround themselves with sycophants. If you declare yourself the supreme law, you build an entire architecture of yes-men.
Nobody's allowed to bring you bad news. Nobody's allowed to tell you that the agricultural yields are failing, or that the working class is starving, or that the foundation is cracking.
They become totally insulated in their own echo chambers. They look at their military, they look at their monuments, and they genuinely believe they have permanently suspended that time lag.
That molut we discussed earlier.
Right. They think the universal law of cause and effect no longer applies to them because they are too big to fail.
Exactly. They substitute a rational universal law for their own arbitrary ego, and in doing so, they lose the ability to accurately read the social physics of their own empire. They lose access to reality.
And notice how the collapse of these massive regimes almost never comes from the direction they were heavily defending against.
Oh, that's true. Pharaoh isn't defeated by a larger, more heavily armed empire marching across the border.
The collapse comes from the internal blind spots they couldn't intellectually predict. A localized labor uprising, an environmental crisis they ignored, a failure of their internal supply chains.
It proves that no human system, no matter how heavily militarized, no matter how obscenely wealthy, can outsmart the universal law of societal balance.
Eventually, the delayed consequences, the molut, expire. The structural rot reaches the foundation. The seeds of exploitation finally bear their poisonous fruit, and the massive, supposedly invincible structure implodes under its own weight.
Which naturally begs the most important question of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
If these systems are always destined to collapse, but the collapse takes so long that people get confused and lose hope, how do we actually know which system is right in the present moment? How do we test this?
Parwez brings all these complex sociological threads together by referencing something completely unexpected, the American philosopher William James.
Specifically, he leans into James's concept of the pragmatic test.
This is where the rubber meets the road. The ultimate argument for this rationally governed, equitable society isn't based on blind faith.
It's not based on who has the most charismatic preachers, or who can build the biggest temples, or who has the oldest, most revered traditions. It is a strictly empirical, real-world challenge.
It is the scientific method applied directly to societal governance. The approach Parwez frames here demands absolute freedom of action. It explicitly, fundamentally rejects coercion.
You cannot force a society to be equitable through violence, because violence itself is a form of zulm, of exploitation.
The challenge issued to all competing socioeconomic systems, whether it's hypercapitalism, state-run communism, military authoritarianism, or anything else, is incredibly simple and profoundly confident.
The challenge is basically implement your program in your sphere of influence. We will implement our program of rational equity in ours, and let the empirical results speak for themselves.
Let the results speak. I love that. There's no force, no thought policing, no inquisitions.
A valid socioeconomic system proves itself purely by generating a thriving, resilient, equitable society in the real world.
If your system is societal polytheism, your 20 conflicting corporate and political bosses, genuinely produces a healthier, more stable, more psychologically fulfilled populace over the long term, then the data will show it. The society will flourish.
But if the universal law of equity, the single constitutional framework of Tawhid, produces a society free from exploitation, where wealth circulates freely and the structure is immune to systemic collapse, the data will show that too.
It is the ultimate expression of confidence in the structural physics of the system. You don't need to argue about theology, you just need to look at the health of the society.
And what's vital to understand is that this proposed system of rational equity isn't some naive utopian fantasy. It doesn't demand impossible, flawless human perfection.
Parwez synthesizes this reality through the concept of the scales, or the balance. We can call it the law of compensation.
In this social physics, you don't need a population of flawless angels who never make a mistake, never act selfishly, or never experience greed.
Human beings are inherently flawed. What you need is a structural system where the sheer volume of constructive, equitable actions naturally outweighs and compensates for the inevitable systemic errors or human missteps.
He uses a brilliant biological metaphor to explain this balance. Think about the human metabolism.
Okay.
In your physical body right now, at this very second, cells are dying. Toxins are being processed. Minor errors in cellular replication are happening. There is a constant, low-level amount of biological destruction occurring.
But as long as your constructive, life-giving processes, the generation of healthy cells, the intake of nutrients, the immune response, maintain a 51% majority over the destructive processes, your body doesn't just survive, it thrives.
The constructive actions literally metabolize, absorb, and correct the destructive ones. A rational, equitably structured society works the exact same way.
It is an organic, self-correcting social metabolism. As long as the overarching structural framework strictly mandates equity and prevents the systemic hoarding of power and resources, the system can absorb the inevitable human flaws without triggering a total catastrophic collapse.
It completely shifts the focus of societal design. Instead of endlessly trying to achieve individual moral perfection through preaching or punitive laws, which is impossible, the focus shifts to establishing structural systemic resilience.
It acknowledges the reality of human nature, but argues that a society governed by a unified, transparent, non-exploitative law will naturally generate enough constructive momentum to outpace its own entropy.
The system heals itself faster than the individuals within it can damage it. So we started this deep dive by looking at the hidden, delayed consequences of the systems we build. That long, invisible germination period. The molute between planting a seed of structural exploitation and finally reaping the bitter harvest of societal collapse.
We looked at how mastering the physical universe means nothing if a society is structurally designed to exploit its own people.
Which leaves us with a final, purely pragmatic challenge to consider. If you evaluate the dominant economic and political systems governing our world today strictly through this pragmatic test.
If you strip away the daily political rhetoric, If you ignore the shiny quarterly stock reports and the technological marvels, and you focus purely on the structural outcomes and those delayed, inevitable consequences.
What invisible seeds of collapse have we already planted deep in the soil of our society? And are we simply sitting around, distracted by the illusion of stability, waiting for the harvest?